8 months pregnant, betrayed by her husband, and suddenly homeless. Elena had nowhere left to go. Her only refuge was her late father's abandoned mountain lodge, a place she hadn't visited in years. She only needed somewhere warm enough to survive the night. But her father had left something behind inside that lodge, something Elena wouldn't understand until the night she had nowhere else to go. And what she discovered would change everything she believed about her father and the meaning of home. Stay with Elena, because sometimes the people we think have left us can still find a way to bring us home. And if stories of kindness, family, and second chances still mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. 3 hours earlier, Elena Reed had still believed she had a home. She stood in the living room with one hand beneath her 8-month belly and her husband's phone trembling in the other. The messages were still glowing on the screen. Months of them. Promises meant for another woman. Plans Elena had never heard about. Words of affection Travis hadn't spoken to his own wife in a very long time. She wanted him to tell her there was some mistake. Instead, Travis sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the floor. How long, Elena asked. He didn't answer. Sometimes silence tells you more than the truth ever could. By sunset, Travis's mother had arrived. Lorraine Reed listened to her son, disappeared upstairs, and returned 20 minutes later carrying 2 suitcases. Elena stared at them. They were hers. Lorraine set them on the porch as snow began blowing across the steps. "This is my son's house. Elena," she said quietly. "You need to find somewhere else to go." There was no shouting. Somehow, that made it worse. Elena looked past her. Travis stood near the staircase. Travis. Just his name. One final chance. She waited for him to remember the 6 years they had shared, the nursery they had painted together. The little girl Elena was carrying, the daughter he had once placed his hand against her belly to feel kick. But Travis lowered his eyes. He said nothing. Some betrayals arrive with shouting. Others arrive in silence. Elena would remember his silence much longer. The door closed. For a moment, she stood outside with snow gathering in her hair. Then the baby moved beneath her coat. Elena pressed her palm against the tiny movement. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, fighting back tears. "I'm still here." She loaded the suitcases herself. There was no mother to call. She had lost her years ago. And her father, Richard Montgomery, had died the previous winter. Once, when Elena was a little girl, Richard had taught her how to build a fire at the old family lodge. She remembered kneeling beside him while he arranged thin pieces of kindling beneath the logs. A fire doesn't need much to start. Ellie, he'd told her, just something small enough to catch. She hadn't thought about that moment in years. After her mother's death, Richard had grown quieter. Elena had mistaken his grief for distance, and he had mistaken hers for a desire to be left alone. Visits became phone calls. Phone calls became Christmas cards. Then even those stopped. When Richard died, Elena was left with an inheritance she didn't understand, and a goodbye neither of them had managed to say. Montgomery Ridge Lodge. She had planned to sell it. She never did. Now, with nowhere else to sleep, Elena drove toward it through the Colorado snow. Nearly 2 hours later, her headlights found an old wooden sign. Montgomery Ridge Lodge, Est, 1948. Elena stopped the SUV. Montgomery. Her father's name. Her name before Travis. For 6 years, she had been Mrs. Elena Reed. Tonight, the Reeds had closed their door on her. And somehow, the name she'd left behind was the only one offering her shelter. The lodge stood farther up the mountain, dark beneath snow-covered pines. Elena unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Cold air greeted her. Dust covered the furniture. White sheets hung over old chairs. The building smelled of cedar, stone, and winters long gone. Elena swept her flashlight across the great room. Then she stopped. Beside the enormous stone fireplace was a neat stack of dry firewood. On top of it lay a small folded piece of paper. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked closer and picked it up. There were only 2 words written on the front. In handwriting she recognized immediately. For Ellie. Her father's handwriting. Elena stood perfectly still. Richard had been dead for almost a year. And yet somehow, on the worst night of her life, her father was waiting for her inside Montgomery Ridge Lodge. Elena stood beside the fireplace for a long time, holding the folded note between both hands. For Ellie. No one had called her that in years. Not Travis, not Lorraine, not even Elena herself. Only her father. She lowered herself carefully onto the stone hearth and opened the paper. The message inside was short. If you're reading this, you came back. Elena swallowed. Below it, Richard had written, "Get warm first. Answers can wait until morning. The wood is dry. Matches are in the blue tin." That was all. So completely Richard that Elena almost laughed. Even from the grave, he couldn't simply say what he felt. But tonight, for the first time, his silence didn't feel empty. It felt unfinished. Elena found the blue tin exactly where he'd said it would be. Her fingers shook as she struck the first match. It died immediately. The second did too. On the third attempt, the kindling caught. She remembered being 7 years old, kneeling beside Richard in this same room while snow pressed against the windows. A fire doesn't need much to start. Ellie. Just something small enough to catch. She fed another piece of wood into the flame. Slowly, warmth began to move through the room. Elena sat there until feeling returned to her fingers. The baby shifted beneath her sweater, and she smiled despite herself. "We made it," she whispered. For tonight, at least, that was enough. But sleep wouldn't come. The lodge had its own language after midnight. Timbers settled. Wind moved through the chimney. Somewhere upstairs, an old pipe knocked against the wall. Elena lay beneath 2 dusty blankets on the couch, watching the fire collapse into glowing embers. Then she heard something different. A faint tapping. 3 sounds. Then silence. Elena raised her head. Another tap. It came from somewhere beyond the old pantry. She told herself it was the wind. Still, she reached for her flashlight. The pantry was colder than the great room. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for dusty jars and a few rusted cans. The tapping came again. Elena followed it to a tall wooden cabinet pushed against the back wall. Something about it bothered her. There was no dust along one side of the floor, as though the cabinet had been moved before. Elena hesitated, then pulled. It was heavier than she expected. 8 months pregnant, she had no business moving furniture in the middle of the night, and she knew it. But curiosity had already taken hold. The cabinet shifted several inches. Behind it was a door. Not a closet door. Something older, narrower, almost deliberately hidden. Elena stared at the brass handle. She had spent summers at Montgomery Ridge Lodge as a child. She knew every staircase, every guest room, every place Richard used to hide peppermint candy for her. She had never seen this door. Her flashlight trembled slightly as she opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of stone, cedar, and old paper. "Elena," she whispered to herself, "this is a terrible idea." But she went down anyway. At the bottom was a small room. Not frightening, just forgotten. Wooden shelves covered 3 walls. Cardboard boxes were stacked beneath them. An old desk sat in the corner beside a green reading lamp. And everywhere Elena looked, there were books. Dozens of them. She pulled one from the nearest shelf. Montgomery Ridge Lodge Guest Ledger, 1997-2001. Elena opened it. Names. Dates. Room numbers. Payments. Normal records from an ordinary mountain lodge. Until she noticed something strange. Beside one guest, room 12 verse 0. Another page. Room 12 verse 00. Then another, and another. Some entries had notes written beside them in Richard's handwriting. Mother and 2 children. Stay until roads clear. Lost his job, give him breakfast. Young woman, no questions tonight. Elena's breathing slowed. She pulled another ledger from the shelf. Same thing. Different years. Different people. Always room 12. Always. Zertonsru. And beside many of the entries were 2 small letters. Her name? Elena ran her thumb over the faded ink. Richard Montgomery. Was her father marking the people he personally allowed to stay? Then she noticed a small wooden box beneath the desk. Her name was written across the lid. Not Elena Reed. Not even Elena Montgomery. Just Ellie. She reached for it. Then stopped. For nearly a year, Elena had believed her father's death had ended every conversation they never managed to have. But sitting beneath the lodge, surrounded by records of strangers Richard had quietly sheltered, she began to wonder if that conversation had been waiting here all along. Upstairs, the fire cracked softly. Elena looked toward the ceiling. For the first time since Lorraine had closed that door behind her, she didn't feel unwanted. She felt as though she had been expected. And suddenly, the question was no longer why Richard had left her the lodge. It was why he had been so certain that one day his daughter would need to come home. Elena didn't open the box right away. She sat at the old desk with both hands resting on its wooden lid, listening to the faint crackle of the fire upstairs. Ellie. Her father had written the name in black ink. For years, Elena had convinced herself that Richard Montgomery had simply stopped needing her. It had been easier to believe that than to admit how much she still needed him. Now, in a hidden room beneath his abandoned lodge, she wasn't so sure. She untied the faded cord around the box. Inside were photographs. Elena at 6, missing her 2 front teeth. Elena asleep against Richard's shoulder beside the fireplace. Elena at 14, holding a trout with an expression of complete disgust while Richard laughed behind her. She had forgotten that laugh. That hurt more than she expected. Beneath the photographs were birthday cards. Happy 25th, Ellie. Happy 26th? I hope you're doing well. None had been mailed. Then she found the letters. Dozens of them. Each addressed to her. Elena picked up the oldest. Ellie, I almost called tonight. Then I decided you probably have enough going on without your old man bothering you. She stopped reading. That was Richard. Always assuming silence was kindness. She opened another. I heard you got married. I wish I'd known before it happened. I hope he understands what he has. Elena pressed her lips together. Richard had never met Travis. At the time, Elena had told herself that was because he didn't care enough to come. Now she wasn't certain she remembered the truth as clearly as she'd believed. She kept reading. Some letters were only half a page. Others ended mid-sentence. Richard wrote about snowstorms, broken pipes, guests, the first robin of spring. But underneath the ordinary details was the same thing, repeated in different ways. I miss you. He simply never wrote those exact words. Then Elena found the final envelope. The date stopped her. January 14th, 3 days before Richard died. Her chest tightened. She remembered that week. She remembered seeing his name on her phone while she and Travis were eating dinner. Dad. She had watched it ring. She had still been angry about Christmas. angry about years of missed birthdays and unfinished conversations. So she turned the phone face down. I'll call him tomorrow. Tomorrow became the next day. Then the hospital called. Elena's hands began to shake as she opened the letter. Ellie, I've spent too many years thinking there would always be another winter. She had to stop. A tear landed on the paper. There are things a father should know how to say to his daughter. I wasn't very good at saying them. After your mother died, I thought giving you space was what you needed. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have gotten in the truck, driven to you, and knocked until you opened the door. Elena covered her mouth. For years, she had wanted him to do exactly that. You don't have to forgive me. But I need you to know something. There will always be a room here for you. Elena lowered the letter. The hidden room blurred through her tears. No, she whispered, because suddenly she remembered the missed call. The ordinary little decision to let a phone ring. How could she have known it would be the last time? Dad! The word broke inside her. Elena bent forward and cried in a way she hadn't cried at Richard's funeral. Not gracefully. Not quietly. She cried for the phone call she never answered. For the Christmases they spent apart. For every time two stubborn, grieving people waited for the other one to cross the distance first. And she cried because now she understood the cruelest thing about regret. Sometimes love survives. Time doesn't. A movement beneath her sweater brought her back. The baby kicked. Elena placed Richard's letter against her chest and rested her other hand over her daughter. Don't do this, she whispered through her tears. The baby moved again. Elena almost smiled. Don't ever let me get too proud to tell you I love you. For several minutes, she simply sat there. Then her eyes returned to the guest ledgers. Room 12. 0 Again and again. She opened another book. This one dated nearly 20 years earlier. December 18th. Room 12, Rizzo, mother, 1 child. January 6th, room 12, 0 couple stranded after wreck. February set, room 12, verse 0 woman arrived after midnight. Don't ask questions. There were hundreds. Elena stared at them. The father, who had seemed incapable of reaching his own daughter, had spent years opening his door to strangers. It didn't make sense. And if she was honest, part of her was angry. You could do this for them, she whispered, looking around the room. Why couldn't you do it for me? A floorboard creaked upstairs. Elena froze. She listened. Nothing. Then came a sound from the front of the lodge. 3 hard knocks. Elena's heart jumped. It was nearly dawn. Snow still covered the mountain road. No one knew she was here. At least, she didn't think anyone did. She climbed the stairs carefully, Richard's final letter still in her hand. Another knock. She crossed the great room and opened the door only a few inches. An older woman stood on the porch. She was perhaps in her late 50s. Wrapped in a wool coat, carrying a paper bag and a thermos. Her eyes moved immediately to Elena's face, then to her belly, then back again. You're Richard's girl. Elena tightened her grip on the door. Who are you? The woman gave a small, almost sad smile. Margaret Ellis. I run the diner down in town. She lifted the bag. Figured you'd need breakfast. Elena stared at her. How did you know I was here? Samuel saw tire tracks heading up the ridge before sunrise. Margaret glanced toward the lodge behind Elena. Then her expression changed. You found the ledgers, didn't you? Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. Margaret stepped inside and slowly removed her gloves. My father wrote R-U-M beside some of the names. Elena said, I thought it meant Richard Montgomery. Margaret looked toward the fireplace. No. She was quiet for a moment. Richard called those people his mercy guests. Elena frowned. Margaret looked back at her. Rima meant room mercy. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Room mercy. Room 12, Margaret said. Your father never charged anyone who stayed there. Why? Margaret's eyes softened. Because most of them had nowhere else to go. She paused. I should know. Elena looked at her. Margaret swallowed. 31 years ago. I came up this mountain with a black eye. $17 in my purse, and my 6-year-old son asleep in the back seat. The room seemed to become very still. Your father gave me the key to room 12. Margaret's voice trembled now. He never asked what my husband had done. Never asked when I could pay him back. She looked toward the old hallway. He just said, You and that boy get warm. We'll worry about tomorrow when it gets here. Elena couldn't speak. Margaret wiped quickly beneath one eye. Your father wasn't perfect. Elena. She looked directly at her. But there are people in this valley who are alive because Richard Montgomery opened a door when nobody else would. Elena looked down at the letter in her hand. There will always be a room here for you. Suddenly, those words meant something different. Room 12 had never really been about free lodging. It was about what happened when a person reached the worst night of their life and discovered that somewhere, somehow, one door was still open. And only hours earlier, Elena had been standing outside a closed one. She looked toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the lodge. Margaret. Yes. Where is room 12? Margaret's face changed. Not fear. Something closer to memory. She slowly turned toward the staircase. Upstairs, she said. Then she looked back at Elena. Your father kept it ready until the day he died. Elena's breath caught. Margaret hesitated before adding, And there's something inside that room I think he always hoped you'd find. Outside, snow began falling again. And for the first time, Elena understood that the box marked Ellie had not been the end of her father's message. It had only been the beginning. Room 12 was at the end of the second-floor hallway. Elena followed Margaret upstairs slowly, one hand on the railing, the other resting beneath her belly. The door looked ordinary. Faded brass number, old pine frame. Nothing about it suggested that hundreds of people had once crossed its threshold carrying the worst days of their lives. Margaret stopped several feet away. I think you should go in alone. Elena looked at her. Why? Margaret's eyes settled on the door. Because the last time Richard showed me this room, he said someday it would belong to someone who understood why it had to stay open. She walked back downstairs. Elena remained. For a moment, she thought about Lorraine's front door closing behind her. Then she turned the knob. Room 12 was small. A narrow bed stood beneath the window. There was a wooden dresser, a rocking chair, 2 folded quilts, and an old iron stove in the corner. No luxury, nothing valuable, just warmth, safety. Time. On the nightstand sat a lamp and a framed photograph. Elena picked it up. Her father stood outside the lodge many years earlier, younger and broad-shouldered, with Elena sitting on his shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 5. On the back, Richard had written, My Ellie, the best thing I ever got right. Elena closed her eyes. All those years, she had measured her father's love by the things he failed to say. Now she was surrounded by evidence that silence had never meant absence. It had meant Richard was broken, too. That didn't erase the missed birthdays. It didn't erase the years apart. Understanding someone, Elena realized, wasn't the same as pretending they never hurt you. Sometimes understanding simply meant seeing the whole person, instead of only the wound they left behind. She sat in the rocking chair. From there, she noticed something carved into the wooden window frame. Names. Dozens of them. Initials, dates, small messages. Thank you. R.M. 1998. You gave us one more night to believe. Made it to Oregon. Kids are doing fine. And near the bottom, I came here with nothing. I left believing I could begin again. Elena traced the words. Hours earlier, she had believed being thrown out of the Reed house meant she had lost everything. But sitting in room 12, she began to see the night differently. She had lost a marriage built on dishonesty. She had lost a house where love could be withdrawn the moment she became inconvenient. Those losses were real. But maybe they weren't the same as losing herself. Elena looked down at her wedding ring. She remembered how proud she'd been the first time someone called her Mrs. Reed. Slowly, she slipped the ring from her finger. She didn't throw it. She didn't curse Travis. She simply placed it on the nightstand. For the first time, she didn't need anger to make herself strong. Downstairs, Margaret was pouring coffee when Elena returned. I'm not selling it, Elena said. Margaret looked up. The lodge. Elena's voice trembled. But the decision didn't. I don't know how I'll pay the taxes. I don't know how I'll fix the roof. I don't even know if the boiler will survive another week. She glanced toward the staircase. But I'm not selling room 12. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then smiled. That sounds like something your father would have said. Elena shook her head gently. No. She placed a hand over her daughter. It sounds like something I said. That distinction mattered. She wasn't becoming Richard. She wasn't living his unfinished life for him. She was choosing what kind of woman her daughter would someday remember. Later that morning, Elena walked outside. The storm had passed. Across the valley, sunlight touched the snow-covered mountains, turning the white slopes gold. She stood beneath the old sign. Montgomery Ridge Lodge. Montgomery. For years, Elena had thought of it only as her father's name. Now she remembered something simpler. It had been hers first. She placed both hands around her belly. Your grandfather wasn't very good with words, she whispered to her unborn daughter. A small kick answered her. Elena smiled through tears. Neither am I sometimes. She looked back at the lodge. But I'm going to try. For the first time since arriving, she didn't see an abandoned building. She saw a roof that needed repairing, rooms that needed cleaning, a fireplace that needed tending, and one room at the end of the hallway that needed to remain open. There were still debts, still broken pipes, still a husband she would eventually have to face. Nothing had magically become easy. But something had changed. Elena had arrived at Montgomery Ridge believing she was the woman nobody wanted. Now she understood that perhaps Richard hadn't left her the lodge because he expected her to save it. Perhaps he had left it because he knew there might come a day when it would have to save her first. And standing there beneath her father's name, Elena made herself one quiet promise. Whatever happened next, the door to room 12 would never close because someone couldn't afford to keep it open. By the end of the week, Elena had learned something important about old buildings. They did not care about promises. The roof still leaked. The boiler still groaned every morning like it resented being alive. 2 upstairs windows refused to close completely. And when the wind came down from the ridge, cold air slipped through the frames. Then came the letter about the property taxes. Elena sat at the long dining table, staring at the amount until the numbers blurred. She had some savings. Not enough. A baby due in a few weeks. A marriage falling apart. And a lodge that seemed determined to break faster than she could repair it. That afternoon, a realtor from Denver called. A developer wanted the property. The offer was generous. More than generous. Enough for Elena to pay what she owed, rent a comfortable apartment, prepare for the baby, and stop worrying about whether the next snowstorm would bring half the roof down. You don't have to decide today, the realtor told her. But Elena knew what everyone would say. Sell it. It was the sensible thing. Maybe even the responsible thing. She looked toward the staircase, toward room 12. For the first time, keeping the lodge felt less like a beautiful promise and more like a frightening choice. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of a truck outside. An old Ford pickup had stopped near the porch. A tall man in his mid-60s climbed out carrying a toolbox. His beard was gray, his coat worn at the elbows. He looked at Elena, then at the roof. Richard's daughter, Elena. Samuel Boone. He held out a hand. Your father and I spent 30 years arguing about how to fix things. Elena almost smiled. Who usually won? Me. Samuel glanced toward the lodge. Richard would have said otherwise. Without being invited, he climbed onto the porch and began inspecting the damaged railing. Margaret said you're thinking about keeping the place. I'm thinking about whether I'm crazy. Samuel nodded. Those aren't always different things. For the first time in days, Elena laughed. Samuel spent the morning checking the roof, pipes, windows, and boiler. When he finally came downstairs, Elena braced herself. Well, it's bad. Her heart sank. Samuel paused. But bad isn't the same as finished. He returned the following morning, and he wasn't alone. Margaret arrived carrying 2 casseroles and a box of baby clothes. Behind her came a plumber named Earl. Then a retired electrician. Then an older couple with several bundles of firewood. By noon, trucks lined the snowy drive. Elena stood on the porch, confused. I can't pay all of you. Nobody answered at first. Then Margaret stepped beside her. We know. Then why are they here? Margaret looked toward the people unloading lumber. See that man in the blue jacket? His house burned down in 2004. Richard gave his family 2 rooms for 6 weeks. She pointed toward the older couple. Their car went off the road during the blizzard of '96. Your father found them. Then toward Earl. Lost his job once. Richard fed his family every Sunday for nearly 3 months. Elena stared at them. I didn't know. No, Margaret said softly. Richard wasn't much for telling people what he'd done. Elena looked down. That sounds like him. Margaret touched her arm. We're not doing this for free, honey. Elena looked at her. Your father paid us a long time ago. Something inside Elena gave way. She turned before anyone could see the tears. But Samuel already had. He pretended not to. Instead, he handed her a hammer. You know how to use one. Not really. Good. Means you haven't learned any bad habits yet. Over the next several days, Elena worked beside them. Carefully, slowly. She couldn't climb ladders, but she painted trim, cleaned rooms, sorted linens, and learned how to patch small cracks. People brought things without being asked. A rocking chair, baby blankets, canned soup, an old wooden crib that Samuel quietly repaired beside the fireplace. With every gift, Elena discovered another piece of Richard's life she had never known. Her father had not been rich. He had not left behind investments or some hidden fortune. He had left something stranger. People who remembered. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Elena stood alone in room 12. Fresh sheets covered the bed. A repaired lamp glowed beside it. On the dresser lay the developer's offer. Elena picked it up. For several seconds, she imagined the easier life that money could buy. Then she heard Samuel calling from downstairs. Elena, you might want to see this. She found him near the front desk holding an old envelope. We pulled this out from behind the wall. Her name was written across it. Again. Ellie. Elena's heartbeat quickened. Samuel handed it to her. I think Richard still has something to say. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. And a key. An old brass key with the number 12 stamped into it. Elena stared at it. Below the key, Richard had written only one sentence. If you decide to keep the door open, don't try to do it alone. Elena looked around the lodge. At Samuel. At the repaired windows. At the donated crib beside the fire. At the muddy footprints of people who had spent the day helping the daughter of a man they had never forgotten. For the first time, she understood. Richard hadn't only left her Montgomery Ridge Lodge, he had left her a community. And perhaps that was the opportunity Elena had almost missed. Not a chance to preserve her father's life, but a chance to build a new one of her own. Outside, another vehicle slowly turned onto the snowy drive. Elena moved toward the window. The color drained from her face. She recognized the black SUV immediately. Travis. And this time, he had come looking for her. Elena knew the SUV before it stopped. For 6 years, she had watched that black vehicle pull into their driveway after work. She had heard its doors close beneath the bedroom window. Once, the sound had meant Travis was home. Now it made something inside her tighten. Samuel followed her gaze. You want me to stay? Elena was quiet for a moment. A week ago, she might have said yes. A week ago, she had stood in the snow waiting for Travis to choose her. Now she slipped Richard's brass key into her pocket. No, she said softly. I need to do this myself. Travis climbed the porch steps without flowers, without luggage, without even an apology waiting on his face. His eyes moved over the lodge, the repaired railing, the trucks, the new windows. Then finally, Elena. You look tired, he said. Elena almost laughed. Of all the things he could have said, somehow that sounded the most like Travis. What are you doing here? I've been calling. I know. You didn't answer. Elena looked at him for a long moment. There was a time when ignoring Travis would have felt impossible. Now she understood that not every ringing phone deserved to be answered. I heard about the lodge, he said. Of course he had. Travis stepped closer. Elena, you're 8 months pregnant. This place needs a fortune in repairs. You can't raise a baby up here by yourself. There it was. Not, I'm sorry. Not, are you all right? Not even, how is our daughter? The lodge. I've spoken to someone about the property, Travis continued. Apparently, it's worth more than your father realized. Elena felt something become very calm inside her. You came because you think I'm going to sell. I'm trying to think about our future. Our future. Elena, don't do this. She looked at the man she had loved for 6 years and suddenly saw what had changed. Not Travis. Her. A week earlier, she had needed him to admit that he had hurt her. Now she didn't. Where were you? Elena asked quietly. When your mother put my suitcases in the snow. Travis looked away. Elena, I looked right at you. He said nothing. I said your name because I thought if I gave you one more second, you'd remember I was your wife. Elena, Mom was upset. No. Her voice remained gentle. That was her choice. She rested a hand on her belly. And standing there doing nothing was yours. Travis stared at her. Elena reached into her coat pocket and removed her wedding ring. She had carried it since leaving it in room 12, uncertain why. Now she knew. She placed it in Travis's palm and folded his fingers over it. You didn't come looking for me when I had nowhere to sleep, she said. Don't come looking for me now because I have something worth taking. Elena, that's not fair. Maybe not. She looked him directly in the eyes. But it's true. Then she stepped back. For once, Travis was the person standing outside the door. Elena closed it. Not hard. Not angrily. Just firmly. She leaned against the wood afterward and closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking. Strength, she realized, didn't always feel strong. Sometimes it felt like trembling after finally saying no. Samuel was standing across the room. He didn't congratulate her. He simply returned to repairing the window. Elena was grateful for that. Outside, Travis's SUV eventually disappeared down the mountain. That evening, the weather changed. Wind struck the lodge hard enough to rattle the windows. Snow erased the road within an hour. Elena was adding another log to the fireplace when someone pounded on the front door. 3 desperate knocks. She froze. For one terrible second, she thought Travis had returned. Then she heard a child's cry. Elena opened the door. A young woman stood outside, snow clinging to her hair. A little boy, perhaps 5, was pressed against her side beneath a thin coat. "Our car slid into a ditch," the woman said, struggling to breathe. "I saw the lights." Her lips were turning blue. "I don't have much money, but how much for a room?" Elena looked at the child. Then toward the staircase, room 12. She thought of Margaret arriving 31 years earlier with $17 and a frightened little boy. She thought of Richard. Then she thought of herself standing outside the Reed house with 2 suitcases in the snow. 2 doors. 2 choices. Elena stepped aside. "You don't owe me anything." The woman stared at her. "What?" "Come inside, both of you." Elena wrapped the boy in a blanket while Samuel brought more wood. She heated soup and found dry clothes among the donations Margaret had collected. Later, when mother and son were asleep in room 12, Elena stood quietly in the doorway. She finally understood something Richard's letters could never have taught her. The lodge wasn't important because it belonged to the Montgomery family. It mattered because, for one frightened person at a time, it belonged to whoever needed it most. Elena placed Richard's brass key on the bedside table. For most of her life, she had thought strength meant holding on. To a marriage, to anger, to unanswered questions. But perhaps strength could also mean knowing what to release and knowing what was worth keeping. Behind her, the fireplace burned steadily. Elena rested both hands over her unborn daughter. "I think I understand him now," she whispered. And for the first time, she wasn't talking about Travis. She was talking about her father. Winter held on longer than anyone expected. By late February, snow still covered Montgomery Ridge, and the nights remained bitter enough to freeze water along the window frames. But inside the lodge, something had changed. The fire rarely went out anymore. Neither did the lights. People from town continued coming up the mountain not because Elena asked them to, but because word had spread that Richard Montgomery's daughter was keeping the lodge. Samuel repaired what he could. Margaret filled the pantry. Others brought blankets, canned food, lumber, and things for the baby. And room 12 remained ready. Always. Elena had stopped thinking of herself as the woman Travis had abandoned. Most mornings, she woke before sunrise, made tea, and stood beside the great stone fireplace with one hand resting on her belly. Sometimes she still missed Richard. Not the father she wished he had been. The father he actually was. Flawed, quiet, grieving, and loving her in ways she had understood too late. That distinction had brought Elena a strange kind of peace. Then, one Thursday night, the pain began. At first, Elena dismissed it. She was 3 weeks from her due date, and there was too much to do. Then another pain came. Stronger. She gripped the kitchen counter. Samuel. He looked up from the broken cabinet hinge he was repairing. One glance at Elena's face was enough. Oh, Lord. Within minutes, everything changed. Margaret was called. Blankets were gathered. Samuel ran outside. Then he came back wearing an expression Elena didn't want to see. The road's disappearing. Snow was falling hard. Elena felt another contraction, and suddenly the old fear returned. Not fear of Travis, not fear of losing the lodge. Something deeper. What if we can't get down? Margaret arrived 15 minutes later, breathless and covered in snow. We're getting you to that hospital. The road. I know. Margaret took Elena's face gently between her hands. Listen to me. You are not doing this alone. Outside, engines began roaring through the storm. Samuel had made calls. Men and women from the valley came with pickup trucks and snowplows. People Elena barely knew began clearing the mountain road one section at a time. The same people Richard had once helped. Now they were making a road for his daughter. Elena watched their headlights through the snow and began to cry. Not from pain, from understanding. Richard had been dead nearly a year, and somehow his kindness was still moving through the world, still finding its way back home. Margaret drove while Samuel followed behind. Halfway down the mountain, another contraction seized Elena. I can't do this, she gasped. Margaret reached across and took her hand. Yes, you can. I can't. Margaret tightened her grip. Your father spent half his life making sure people didn't face the worst nights of their lives alone. She looked at Elena. We're not letting his daughter be the first. Elena closed her eyes. And somewhere beneath the fear, she heard Richard's voice from decades earlier. A fire doesn't need much to start. Ellie, just something small enough to catch. She held Margaret's hand and kept going. Just before sunrise, Elena's daughter entered the world. Healthy, loud, perfect. When the nurse placed the baby against her chest, Elena stared at the tiny face and wept. Hi, she whispered. The baby opened her eyes. Elena touched her cheek. There are so many things I want to tell you. Her voice trembled. So I'm going to start now. She leaned closer. I love you. No waiting. No pride. No silence. 3 months later, spring finally reached Montgomery Ridge. Elena returned to the lodge with her daughter in her arms. The snow melted from the roof. Wildflowers appeared along the road. The creek behind the lodge began running again. And Montgomery Ridge Lodge officially reopened. Most rooms had prices. Room 12 did not. Elena placed a small wooden sign beside its door. The Mercy Room. For those who need one safe night before tomorrow begins. She stood there for a while, holding her daughter. Then Samuel called from downstairs. Elena, fire's getting low. She smiled. I've got it. Elena walked into the great room and placed another log on the flames. Above the fireplace remained Richard's old words. When someone comes in from the cold, never ask what they can pay, ask what they need. Elena looked at her daughter. For years, she had believed inheritance meant what someone left to you. Now she knew better. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is what someone leaves inside you. A lesson, a choice, a little warmth to carry forward. Outside, the mountains were turning green. Inside, Elena held her daughter close. And the fire kept burning. 1 year later, winter returned to Montgomery Ridge. Snow covered the pines and gathered along the old wooden sign at the entrance to the lodge. Inside, the fire burned steadily, filling the great room with the warm scent of cedar. Elena sat beside it with her daughter asleep against her chest. A year had passed since she'd arrived on this mountain 8 months pregnant, carrying 2 suitcases and believing she had lost everything. Now the lodge was alive again. Travelers came and went. Samuel still found something to repair every week. Margaret still brought more food than anyone could possibly eat. And at the end of the upstairs hallway, room